So let's move on then. So this is just a summary of some of the mechanisms of action of riluzole. Adam Doble is here, who knows much more about this than I do. But the important point, I think, to notice, and I'll put in another, is that maybe one of the reasons that riluzole has an effect is that it is a multifaceted drug. It has many modes of action apart from affecting so-called excitotoxicity. For example, I've just, in the last line, mentioned that with Chris Miller, when I was at King's, we found that it could affect axonal transport and so on. It's also, there are many other possible impacts upon neuronal function which could be beneficial. The question then is this a generic effect? And we went on to show, Vincent was involved, but Gilbert and I ran a large trial of patients with progressive supranuclear palsy. This is a Parkinson's plus disease and multiple system atrophy with riluzole, with survival as an endpoint, so we could be robust in our interpretations, taking the leaf out of Vincent's book and taking it forward, and there was absolutely no effect at all. We could actually believe the result of that trial, I believe, because one of the problems, as you will see, is what do we learn from negative trials? The same applies to Huntington's disease, but again, the endpoints there are less. So I believe the data, I would, wouldn't I, on PSP and MSA, and I think it does tell us something about that we should be inquiring about the nature of the drug effect of riluzole. Not that I want to drag us back to that era, but there are unanswered questions there. So the gains, well, the drugs can influence survival. I think that's pretty fundamental. Prognostic factors came out of this. I haven't gone into that and won't. But we could identify slow and fast progressors, etc., although we still can't identify within the trial who responds and who doesn't. And that is one of the big questions for the future, which will be addressed by the next generation of researchers. Stratification. How are we going to deal with understanding who are responders and who aren't within the rubric of a clinical trial? I hadn't the definite answer to that, but I've got a couple of suggestions. We also learned that survival is not exactly equivalent to function. So if you measure function by muscle strength, etc., we didn't see the same size. We didn't see the effect. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that, but it taught us caution in that direction. And of course, it offered the prospect of success to pharma, and ALS could be seen as a model for other less tractable neurodegenerative disorders, and I hope that is still the case. This is Sisyphus rolling his ball to the top of the hill, condemned for eternity to have it roll down again. This is exactly what it's felt like doing clinical trials over the last 20 years or so. On the other hand, we've had one success if we've had 2 decades of failure. But failure will not last forever, I'm sure. So how do we overcome it, though? We have to have an intelligent way of resolving this. So here are some of the drugs that have been tested. I haven't tried to make this absolutely comprehensive. This is a negative story. At the bottom, we still don't know. These are some current ones. We've just heard about dexpramipexole, which sadly has been ruled out after initial hopes and so on. So my question is, do we know why these studies were negative? And very often we don't. Do we know that the drug that we were giving or the agent actually hit the target? What evidence do we have that that is the case? And in most cases, there isn't any evidence. We just hope that it reached the target. So we don't know why they were negative. So we are failing to learn from negative studies. We can learn from negative studies, as I think we did from the NIPS, the PSP and MSA ones, but that didn't get us very far, to be honest. So how do we break this impasse? Well, I'm going to come back to that. But first I'm going to go on to the other major breakthrough, and there are many, and I'm being partial here, is of course genetics. So this is Watson and Crick at the top, and my colleague, would have been my colleague at King's had she survived, Rosalind Franklin. I think she deserves a place in this, as you know. So we started, of course, people started collecting families, Vincent, myself, others, way back in the 80s, but it was a hard job because the MRC, Medical Research Council, said it couldn't be done. You'd never find genes in ALS. But people did find families, and of course that led to the finding of all these gene mutations, starting with the SOD1 gene in 1993. And that led also to us appreciating that there were individuals who had no obvious or known family history, who carried mutations. So begin to link in the story that sporadic disease might also be occasionally genetically determined. These were the same mutations in SOD, for example. And then, of course, that led on to the genome-wide studies, which are ongoing, and leads to great complexity, and there are others here far more knowledgeable about that. The point about this was that, as you know, you need very big numbers. Now, Ammar Al-Chalabi, my colleague at King's, who's leading some of these genome-wide association studies, tells me that very soon they'll have 15,000 cases and 30,000 controls. Where does it end? My suggestion is that it probably goes on, because you get added information from numbers. And for example, in Alzheimer's now, they're beginning to find new gene loci through these very big studies of 30,000 cases and so on, which otherwise they wouldn't have found. The challenge is going to be putting that into context, understanding what it means. But I do think it's an important way forward. And of course, that then feeds back into the familial studies and so on. So I think the whole thing has been a huge advance, and so far, I think a success. Stepping back to the families, though, this is, of course, the SOD1. This is about SOD1. This is the SOD1 protein here, the 153 amino acids. All I really want to say is that there are 168 mutations in a protein which has 153 amino acids. That is, there are mutations at various sites, and there are some mutations that lop off a bit of the protein at the end. What does that suggest? I mean, maybe we can come back to that. To me, that suggests it's a problem with the protein rather than the function of SOD1 in its enzymatic sense, and I think that was probably generally agreed. Perhaps most likely something to do with accumulation of fragments, abnormal fragments of protein. So it has taught us a lot, and it's given us the best model we have, the SOD1 transgenic model, to work on. But I have some reservations about that, or at least some words of caution. I just show this to show you an example of the GWAS studies that we have, and others here have collaborated. And one of the great things here is that we all have to pitch in and collaborate. We have to somehow bury some egos somewhere. Not easy for us, or for some of us. So this just shows you the sort of plot of one of the loci. This is on chromosome 19, but I should have really shown you chromosome 9, because that GWAS data led to the finding of the most important gene that we've yet found, I think, which is the chromosome 9 mutation, the hexanucleotide expansion. This summarizes, I apologize for this very full slide. The message really is just that everything yellow here is what you might call classical ALS, and these are all different genes. These are loci, these is the chromosome address, and these are the actual genes that have been found. So when we started, Vincent and I, there was nothing, then there was SOD, and now, well, we've got more than we can sort of cope with. And as I say, making sense of that is the great challenge. It's very exciting, very important. But one thing it does tell us is that ALS isn't one disease. If you take causation as being, if you like, the marker of a disease. I won't dwell on that, except simply to point out this one here, which is the ALS2. It overlaps with frontotemporal dementia. So, you know, we knew over the last 20 years, we did more and more work, all of us, on cognition, imaging, showing that this is a multi-system disease with predilection for the motor neurons, and then along comes this disease which clearly overlaps with frontotemporal dementia, not to our surprise now, but very importantly. All right. So, splitting, here are the lumpers and splitters. We don't have to take sides, but probably the splitters of one, and heterogeneity is now a given. And if we don't deal with that, we are going to have problems with devising new therapies. I don't know how to deal with this yet, but I think it is a problem that needs our attention. What about phenotypes? That's another major advance, understanding phenotypes. Well, arguably, we're still where we were with Charcot, and that's fine. If that's true, that's all right. We've got Lou Gehrig in the States, who died within about 3 years, and we've got Stephen Hawking, who's going after 40 plus. I think we have good reason to believe they did have ALS. They did have ALS. So there's huge difference. If we could discover what causes that difference in survival, even if it doesn't, it's not the answer to the disease, if you like. If we could modify the disease, that would be very, very useful. And there is work going on with genetic factors which modify not just risk, but how long you survive with the disease. And I think that is another very important area. Just to say phenotypes, again, in the Paris school here, we've called these down at the bottom. We've got the legs here, and the arms, the flail arm on the flail legs. Pierre Marie clearly delineated this. I think Vulpian and Bernhard, this flail arm man in a barrel syndrome. So nothing is new, but we did look at the survival, and have we got that? Oh no, it's not come up on there, but just to say, this is survival curves. This is the bulbar onset. So this is very rapid down here. It's bad end to B. This is the good end to B. And the survival of these flail arm, flail legs is very much better. That's just eyeballing the patient, saying this is the category they fall into. But that's probably subject to all sorts of errors of interpretation. And so one other thing we did, I'll miss out this slide because I think we'll go straight on to the other one. Let me go. It's not changing. Are we getting? Yep, there we are. So if you phenotype according to what you see with the patient here, this is just a variant of the diagram I showed you before with the bulbar PMA, progressive muscular atrophy, and bulbar, probably better to show you on this one, shown here. These are the bad prognoses, and these are the better ones. But then we used a computer to type the patients, feeding in a lot of information about prognosis. I won't go into the details for you. And the machine did it better than we did. So if I show you that, so this is the computer modeling showing all the clinical information that we have. It's called a technique called latent cluster analysis. It divided the groups up. Now the groups do not correspond to bulbar, limb. They're mixed up. And the computer is finding something in the data we feed in on their natural history that we can't see. How valid that is, I can only speculate. But I do think that what we see sometimes in the clinic may not be the most important factor. And we need to look at so-called unbiased methods of phenotyping patients. That is a challenge I give ourselves. And I think there is a future in that if we're going to combine phenotype with genotype.